The early morning sun peeked through the windows of Pete's diner, casting long shadows across the worn leather booths. Harold Thompson, a 93-year-old veteran, woke through the door at exactly 7 o'clock a.m., just like he had done every morning for the past 20 years. The small bell above the door rang softly, announcing his arrival to the familiar faces inside. Harold moved slowly but steadily, his back straight despite his age. His shoes were polished to a shine, and his clothes were perfectly pressed, old habits from his military days that he never gave up. On his head sat his prized possession, a navy blue veteran's cap with gold threading that showed his service in World War II. The cap might have faded over the years, but the pride it represented never did. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson." Sarah, the young waitress, called out with a warm smile. She was already walking towards his usual corner booth with a steaming cup of black coffee. She was the granddaughter of Pete, the original owner, and had grown up watching Harold come in every day. "Morning, Sarah," Harold replied with a gentle nod. His voice was soft but clear, carrying the weight of years of stories behind it. He carefully placed his folded newspaper on the table and slid into his seat, his movements showing the careful precision of someone who had learned to work with, not against, the limitations of age. The booth had become more than just a seat to Harold. It was his window to the world. From here, he could see the entire diner, the street outside, and most importantly, the framed photographs on the wall that told the story of their small Nebraska town. Among them was a black and white picture from 1946 showing the diner's opening day. Harold had been there, standing proud in his uniform, next to his beautiful wife Martha. Martha, even after 20 years without her, Harold's heart still ached when he thought of her smile. She used to join him every morning at this very booth, solving crossword puzzles while he read the news. These days, he carried on their tradition alone, but somehow her presence still lingered in the familiar scent of coffee and fresh-baked bread. Sarah returned with his usual breakfast order: 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast, and a side of crispy bacon. "Made sure the cook got the eggs just how you like them, Mr. Thompson," she said, setting the plate down carefully. "Not too runny, not too firm." "Thank you, dear," Harold smiled, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. He noticed how Sarah always took extra care with his order, just like her grandmother used to do. 3 generations of this family had served him breakfast, and each one seemed to inherit that same kindness. As he unfolded his newspaper, Harold's weathered hands moved with deliberate care. Years of holding rifles and later working as a carpenter had left them strong despite their age. The morning paper was another part of his ritual. Current events first, then sports, and finally, the crossword puzzle that he and Martha used to love. The diner slowly filled with the morning regulars. Tom, the local mailman, gave Harold a respectful nod as he passed. Mrs. Jenkins from the flower shop waved from her table, and little Jimmy, who helped his father deliver bread to the diner, stopped by to show Harold his latest school project, a report about World War II. "Would you mind checking if I got everything right, Mr. Thompson?" Jimmy asked eagerly, holding out his papers. Harold set aside his newspaper with a smile. This wasn't the first time local children had come to him for help with their history assignments. He had become something of a living library for the community, though he always told the stories with humility rather than glory. The morning light grew stronger, filling the diner with a golden glow. Through the large windows, Harold could see the American flag outside the post office across the street, gently waving in the Nebraska breeze. It reminded him of his brothers in arms, many now gone, who had fought alongside him for that flag and everything it represented. Harold took another sip of his coffee, savoring the quiet moment. At 93, he had learned to appreciate these simple pleasures: the warmth of the cup in his hands, the friendly chatter of the diner, the respect and kindness of his community. Little did he know that this regular morning, so like countless others before it, was about to become anything but ordinary. The peaceful morning at Pete's diner shattered like broken glass when the first motorcycle roared into the parking lot. Then came another, and another, until 5 large bikes lined up outside, their engines growling like angry beasts before falling silent. The morning sun glinted off their chrome pipes and black paint. Harold looked up from his newspaper, his cup of coffee pausing halfway to his lips. Through the large diner windows, he watched as the bikers dismounted their motorcycles. They were all big men, dressed in black leather jackets covered in patches and silver chains. Their leader stood out, a tall man with a thick, dark beard and arms covered in tattoos. Sarah, the young waitress, nearly dropped her coffee pot when the diner's door burst open. The bell above didn't just ring, it jangled violently as all 5 men strutted in. The smell of leather and motorcycle exhaust followed them, mixing strangely with the scent of coffee and bacon. Well, what do we have here? The leader said, his voice rough and loud. His eyes scanned the diner like a predator seeking prey, finally settling on Harold in his corner booth. A smirk spread across his face as he nudged one of his companions. Look at this, boys. Seems we found ourselves a real piece of history. The other customers in the diner suddenly became very interested in their plates. Tom the mailman hunched lower in his seat, and Mrs. Jenkins from the flower shop clutched her purse tighter. Even little Jimmy, who had been showing Harold his school project, quickly scurried back to his father's table. The bikers made their way through the diner, deliberately bumping tables as they passed. Coffee cups rattled on saucers, and a fork clattered to the floor. Nobody moved to pick it up. They walked as if they owned the place, their heavy boots thudding against the checkered floor. Nice hat, old-timer, one of the bikers said, reaching out to flip the brim of Harold's veteran cap. Harold remained still, his weathered hand steady as he carefully folded his newspaper and placed it beside his plate. His blue eyes, clear and sharp despite his age, met the biker's gaze without flinching. Sarah tried to step in, holding her coffee pot like a shield. "Gentlemen, can I get you seated? We have some fresh coffee." Her voice trembled slightly, but she stood her ground, remembering how Harold had always been kind to her family. The leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the diner's walls. "Oh, we'll sit wherever we please, sweetheart." He turned to his gang. "Boys, I think we found our breakfast spot. Let's make ourselves comfortable." The other bikers grinned, showing teeth that gleamed as menacingly as their chains. They surrounded Harold's booth, one of them sliding onto the bench across from him, while the others loomed nearby. The leather of their jackets creaked as they moved, and their chains jingled like warning bells. The leader pulled up a chair from another table, spinning it around and straddling it backward, his arms resting on its back as he stared at Harold. "So, old man," the leader said, reaching out to grab Harold's coffee cup. He took a long sip, then grimaced and set it down hard enough to splash coffee onto the table. "Tell us about this fancy hat of yours. You really fight in the big one, or did you just buy this at some army surplus store?" Harold watched the coffee spread across the table, creating a small pool that threatened to drip onto his neatly pressed pants. His face remained calm, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw set just a bit firmer. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but the warm, friendly atmosphere of Pete's diner had turned cold and tense. The regular customers watched in worried silence, their own breakfasts forgotten. Sarah stood by the counter, her hand hovering near the phone, unsure whether to call the police. The bikers' shadows loomed over Harold's table like dark clouds before a storm. Their leather jackets creaked as they shifted impatiently, waiting for the old veteran's response. The leader drummed his fingers on the back of his chair, the sound like distant thunder. Harold Thompson sat straight in his booth, his 93 years of life experience visible in every line of his face. He had faced worse threats than these in his long life, survived more dangerous situations. But now, in his favorite diner, surrounded by neighbors too afraid to help, he had a choice to make. One that would turn this ordinary morning into something none of them would ever forget. Harold Thompson's hands rested calmly on the coffee-stained table, his fingers interlaced. Years of military training had taught him that sometimes the strongest response was stillness. He watched as the biker leader picked up his plate of half-eaten breakfast and pushed it aside with a screech of ceramic against formica. "What's the matter, old-timer? Cat got your tongue?" the leader taunted, leaning closer. His beard was flecked with gray, and a long scar ran down the side of his neck. The silver chains on his jacket clinked as he moved, like tiny bells announcing trouble. One of the other bikers, a younger man with a red bandana, reached across the table and grabbed Harold's veteran's cap. "Let's see what we've got here," he said, turning the cap around in his hands. "World War II? Huh. Probably bought it at a yard sale." Harold's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but clear. "Young man," he said, looking directly at the one holding his cap, "that belonged to my unit, the 101st Airborne Division." His words carried no anger, just a simple statement of fact. The diner had fallen so silent that the buzz of the fluorescent lights seemed loud. Sarah stood frozen by the counter, her coffee pot clutched tight. The cook, Pete Jr., watched through the kitchen window, his spatula gripped like a weapon. 101st Airborne? Another biker snorted, adjusting his fingerless leather gloves. That's a real fancy unit. Bet you were just peeling potatoes while the real soldiers did the fighting. The others laughed, but their laughter had an edge to it, like they were trying too hard. Harold slowly reached for his napkin and wiped the spilled coffee from the table. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. Everyone had their part to play, he said. Even the cooks were essential. They kept us alive just as much as any rifle. The leader's face reddened slightly. He hadn't expected such calm responses. Hey, boys, he called out louder now, maybe we should test if this old-timer remembers his training. See if he can still stand at attention. Mrs. Jenkins from the flower shop suddenly stood up, her chair scraping backward. That's enough, she started to say, but her voice quivered. The leader turned and fixed her with such a cold stare that she sat back down, her face pale. Harold noticed how the other customers wanted to help but were too scared. He understood their fear. He had seen it before, in villages across Europe, when good people faced bullies and thugs. But he had also seen what happened when someone finally stood up. Your coffee's getting cold, Harold said to the leader, nodding at the cup the man had stolen. Though I suppose you're not really here for the coffee, are you? His blue eyes, sharp despite his age, studied each biker in turn. The youngest biker, still holding Harold's cap, fidgeted uncomfortably. Something in the old man's steady gaze made him feel like a schoolboy caught misbehaving. He set the cap down on the table, trying to make it look like he was throwing it, but actually placing it carefully. You think you're clever, old man? The leader growled, his attempt at intimidation growing more forced with each calm response. He grabbed the cap again and dangled it just out of Harold's reach. Maybe we should see how well this flies out in the parking lot. Sarah finally found her courage and stepped forward. Please, she said, Mr. Thompson is a regular here. He's been coming since before I was born. If you want breakfast, I'll serve you, but... Shut it, sweetheart. The leader snapped, but Harold raised his hand slightly, and Sarah stopped. She recognized that gesture. It was the same one he used when telling stories to the local children, the signal that something important was about to happen. The morning sun had risen higher now, streaming through the windows and catching the dust motes in the air. They danced around the scene like tiny witnesses to the tension building in Pete's diner. Harold's coffee cup sat empty, a ring of brown staining its inside, much like the circles of time that had shaped his long life. You know, Harold said, his voice taking on a different tone, one that made everyone in the diner lean forward slightly. Since you seem so interested in my service. He paused, eyes focusing on something distant, as if seeing beyond the diner's walls to a time long past. His next words would change everything, not with violence or anger, but with something far more powerful. Truth. The leader of the bikers wasn't used to being ignored. Harold's calm manner made him angrier than any shouting match could have. He slammed his fist on the table, making the silverware jump and dance. You think you're better than us, old man? With your fancy war stories and your little hat? Something flickered in Harold's eyes then, not fear, but a spark of memory. The sound of the fist hitting the table had reminded him of distant explosions, of moments when young men like these thought violence was the answer to everything. That little hat saw more action than you boys will ever understand, Harold said quietly, his fingers tracing the water rings on the table. Normandy. Bastogne. The eagle's nest. Each word carried weight, like stones dropping into still water. Normandy? One of the bikers laughed, but it sounded forced. That's just stuff from movies. Bet you can't even prove you were there. He kicked Harold's booth, making the whole seat shake. Sarah watched from behind the counter, her hand now gripping the phone. But Harold gave her a small shake of his head. He didn't want outside help. Not yet. This was about something more important than just stopping a fight. The leader stood up suddenly, his chair scraping backward with a harsh sound. He towered over Harold's booth, his shadow falling across the old veteran's face. Maybe we need to teach you some respect, he growled. Seems like you forgot who's in charge here. Harold's hands, which had been resting on the table, slowly moved to his shirt pocket. The bikers tensed, probably expecting a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a worn leather wallet. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. "You want proof?" Harold asked, opening the wallet. "Here's what respect looks like." He pulled out a black and white photograph, creased from years of being carried but still clear enough to see. The photograph showed a much younger Harold, standing in front of a bombed-out building. He wore a paratrooper's uniform, his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. But what caught everyone's attention was the small group of children around him, French kids, smiling as he shared his rations with them. "That was taken 2 days after D-Day," Harold said, his voice growing stronger. "After we liberated a village from people who thought bullying others made them strong." His eyes met the leader's gaze steadily. They learned differently. The leader snatched the photo from Harold's hands. "Could be fake," he said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "Could be from some movie set." He passed the photo to his friends, who studied it with uncomfortable expressions. Harold waited until they finished looking at the photo before speaking again. "Behind that building," he said, pointing to the photograph, "there was a young German soldier, not much older than you boys. He thought his uniform and his weapons made him powerful. Want to know what happened to him?" The bikers shifted uneasily. The story of the German soldier hung in the air like smoke, waiting to be told. Even the leader, despite his tough act, couldn't help leaning in slightly to hear more. But Harold's expression changed then. The spark in his eyes became a flame, and he slowly began to push himself up from the seat. His movements were careful but purposeful, like an old lion who still remembered how to show his strength. "Before I tell you that story," Harold said, now standing at his full height, "let me ask you something. Those patches on your jackets, the ones about freedom and bravery, did you earn them? Or are they just for show, like that tough guy act you're putting on?" The diner fell completely silent. Even the kitchen sounds stopped, as if the whole place was holding its breath. The morning sun through the windows cast long shadows behind the bikers, making them look suddenly smaller. The leader's face flushed red with anger, but there was something else in his eyes now. Uncertainty. He hadn't expected this kind of resistance, especially not from a 93-year-old man. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, trembling slightly. "You're pushing your luck, old-timer," he said, but his voice cracked slightly. The other bikers looked at each other, unsure whether to escalate or back down. The situation had shifted, like a wave about to break, and everyone could feel it. Harold stood straight and tall, his veteran's bearing showing through despite his age. He was about to say something that would either diffuse the situation or make it explode, and somehow, everyone in Pete's diner knew these next words would change everything. Harold's voice filled Pete's diner with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep in time. "That German soldier I mentioned," he began, "was sitting behind that building, crying. Not because he was hurt, but because he was hungry. Scared. Just a kid who'd believed all the tough talk until he saw what it really meant." The biker leader's shoulders tensed, but he didn't interrupt. Something in Harold's voice made everyone listen, like they were hearing a truth they'd always known but forgotten. "I found him there while checking for snipers," Harold continued, his eyes focused on a point far beyond the diner's walls. "He raised his rifle at me, hands shaking so bad he probably couldn't have hit the broadside of a barn. But that's not what I remember most." Harold carefully reached for his coffee cup, took a small sip, and set it down again. His hands were steady, unlike the young Germans in his story. "What I remember is how he looked exactly like my younger brother back home. Same age, same scared eyes. And in that moment, the war stopped being about uniforms and sides." The youngest biker, the one who had first grabbed Harold's cap, slowly sank into a nearby seat. His tough guy mask was slipping, revealing a face that couldn't have been more than 20 years old. "I put my rifle down," Harold said, looking directly at the biker leader now. "Right there in the middle of a war zone. The other soldiers thought I was crazy. But sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show kindness when everyone expects violence." Sarah had stopped pretending to clean tables and stood listening, tears forming in her eyes. Even the cook, Pete Jr., had come out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron as he listened to a story he'd never heard before, despite knowing Harold for years. "That German soldier, and I shared my rations that day," Harold continued. "He showed me a picture of his family, just like I showed you mine. We didn't speak the same language, but we understood each other. 2 young men caught in something bigger than ourselves, trying to act tough because we were terrified." The leader's face had changed. The anger was still there, but now it seemed directed at something else, something inside himself. His hands had unclenched, and his aggressive stance had softened almost imperceptibly. He survived the war, Harold said, touching the photograph that still lay on the table. I know because he found me 30 years later. Traveled all the way from Hamburg to thank me. Said that moment of kindness saved more than his life. It saved his humanity. Made him realize that real strength isn't about intimidation. Harold slowly sat back down, his movements deliberate but dignified. He had a motorcycle shop in Germany. Loved bikes because they represented freedom to him. Real freedom, not the kind you pretend to have by making others feel small. The diner remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the tense quiet of fear, but the deep silence of understanding. The morning sun had shifted, and its light fell across Harold's veteran's cap on the table, highlighting the gold threading that spoke of honor earned, not taken. I'm not telling you this story because I want your respect, Harold said, his voice gentle but firm. I'm telling you because 50 years ago, I learned something that took a war to teach me. Real power isn't about who can cause the most fear. It's about who has the courage to break the cycle of violence. He reached out and picked up his cap, placing it back on his head with quiet dignity. That German soldier taught me as much about courage as any battle. And every morning, when I put on this cap, I remember not just the fighting, that moment of sharing food with an enemy, because that's what the war was really about. Not proving who was tougher, but protecting the right of every person to live with dignity. The biker leader's face had lost all its hardness now. In its place was something that looked almost like shame, mixed with a dawning understanding. He looked at his own reflection in the diner's window, at the man who had come in trying to intimidate an old veteran, only to be taught a lesson about true strength. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado replaced by something that looked remarkably like respect. The story hung in the air between them all, changing the very atmosphere of Pete's diner from a place of confrontation to a space of unexpected wisdom. The biker leader stood frozen, his eyes fixed on Harold's veteran cap. His tough facade had cracked, revealing something unexpected underneath. Slowly, he pulled out a chair and sat down, no longer looming over Harold but meeting him at eye level. You mentioned Bastogne, the leader said, his voice different now, softer, almost hesitant. The Battle of the Bulge? His hands, which had been clenched in fists earlier, now lay flat on the table, revealing a small tattoo on his right wrist. Never forget. Harold nodded, studying the man's changed expression. December 1944. Coldest winter I'd ever known. We were surrounded, low on supplies. Every day was a fight just to stay alive. The leader's throat worked for a moment before he could speak. My grandfather. He started, then had to clear his throat. My grandfather was there too, but not with the 101st. He was with the 10th Armored Division. The other bikers exchanged confused looks. They'd never heard their leader talk about his family before, especially not like this, with a voice full of emotion. The 10th Armored, Harold said, his eyes lighting up with recognition. They were there before us, holding the line. Brave men, every one of them. Without them, Bastogne might have fallen before we could get there. The leader reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, much like Harold's. From it, he took an old photograph, creased and yellowed with age. His hands trembled slightly as he placed it on the table. This was him, he said. Technical Sergeant James Morrison. He never talked much about the war, except, the leader paused, looking at Harold with new eyes. Except for one story, about the day the paratroopers came. Sarah had moved closer now, coffee pot forgotten in her hands. The other customers in the diner leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. We were almost out of ammunition, the leader continued, reciting the story as if he heard it 1,000 times. Running low on food, medical supplies. The Germans had us surrounded, and the weather was too bad for air support. Then one morning, December 26th, Harold finished quietly. The skies cleared just enough. General Patton's Third Army broke through from the south. The leader's eyes widened. That's exactly how my grandfather told it. He said it was like watching angels drop from the sky, the 101st Airborne coming down to reinforce them. Said he'd never seen a more beautiful sight in his life. Harold reached out and picked up the leader's photograph, handling it with the same care he showed his own. In it, a young soldier in winter gear stood beside his tank, a determined smile on his face despite the snow and exhaustion. I might have met him, Harold said thoughtfully. We worked closely with the armor units after the drop. Every tank crew shared their supplies with us, even though they barely had enough for themselves. True brotherhood. The leader wiped his eyes quickly with the back of his hand. His fellow bikers pretended not to notice, but their own expressions had softened considerably. Grandpa passed last year, the leader said quietly. I wear this jacket, ride that bike, trying to be as tough as I thought he was. But the way he told that story, he shook his head. He never talked about being tough. He talked about brotherhood, about men coming together to help each other when it mattered most. The morning sun had risen higher now, warming the diner with golden light. The American flag outside the window cast a moving shadow across both men's photographs on the table. Two pieces of history, unexpectedly connected across time. Your grandfather, Harold said, carefully handing the photograph back, was one of the heroes who held Bastogne until we could get there. We called ourselves the battered bastards of Bastogne, but we couldn't have done it without men like him. The leader took the photo with trembling hands, looking at it as if seeing it for the first time. The tough, angry biker from minutes ago had disappeared, replaced by a grandson finally understanding his grandfather's legacy. I've been disrespecting his memory, the leader said, so quietly that only Harold could hear. Acting like strength comes from fear, when he taught me it comes from helping others. The other bikers watched their leader transform before their eyes, and something in them changed too. The atmosphere in Pete's diner had shifted completely, from tension to understanding, from confrontation to connection. The biker leader stood up slowly, his leather jacket creaking in the silence of Pete's diner. Everyone watched as he did something unexpected. He took off his jacket. Underneath, he wore a simple black t-shirt that revealed a military tattoo on his right arm. USNST 2008 to 2016. I served too, he said, his voice thick with emotion. 8 years in the Marines, but somewhere along the way, I forgot what that really meant. He laid his jacket carefully on the back of his chair, as if setting down a heavy burden. The other bikers exchanged glances, then one by one, they began removing their jackets too. The youngest one, who had first grabbed Harold's cap, revealed a similar tattoo, newer, less faded. 3 tours in Afghanistan, he said quietly. Got out last year. Joined the club because... He paused, looking down at his hands. Because I missed having brothers around me, missed belonging to something bigger than myself. Harold nodded with understanding. That need for brotherhood, it never really leaves you. After the war, that's why I came here every morning. Pete Sr., Sarah's grandfather, was a Korean War vet. This place became our meeting spot, our way of staying connected. Sarah, who had been listening nearby, wiped tears from her eyes. Grandpa always said Mr. Thompson was the reason this diner became more than just a restaurant. He said it was a place where veterans could feel at home. The biker leader pulled his chair closer to Harold's table, but this time with respect rather than intimidation. I'm James, he said, named after my grandfather. You would have been ashamed to see how I acted today. No, Harold said gently. You would have been proud to see how you changed. That takes more courage than staying angry. He gestured to the empty seats around his table. Join me? Coffee's still hot. One by one, the bikers settled around the table. Sarah hurried to bring fresh cups, her hands steadier now as she poured coffee for everyone. The other customers in the diner began to relax, smiling at the unexpected turn of events. Tell us more about Bastogne, James asked, holding his coffee cup with both hands. About my grandfather's unit. I know some of it, but... He looked around at his fellow bikers. We could all learn from those stories. Harold's eyes twinkled. Well, it wasn't just the cold and the Germans we had to worry about. Your grandfather's tank crew once had to deal with a fox that kept stealing their rations. The bikers leaned in, eager to hear more. As Harold spoke, the morning light filled the diner with a warm glow. Mrs. Jenkins from the flower shop quietly ordered breakfast for everyone at the table. Tom the mailman delayed his route to listen. Even little Jimmy and his father moved closer to hear the stories. We were all so young back then, Harold continued, showing them more photos from his wallet. Not much older than some of you. The youngest in your grandfather's crew was just 18, lied about his age to enlist. James looked at his own young club members with new eyes. Just like Tommy here, he said, nodding to the youngest biker. "Came to us looking for direction, same as we all did after getting out." "The uniform changes," Harold said wisely, "but the need for purpose doesn't. After every war, men come home looking for meaning, for brotherhood. Some find it in motorcycle clubs, some in diners like this. What matters is how we use that brotherhood." The other bikers nodded, understanding flowing between them like the coffee Sarah kept pouring. The tough masks they'd worn earlier had disappeared completely, replaced by genuine interest and respect. Pete Jr. emerged from the kitchen with plates of fresh breakfast. "On the house," he said, setting them down, "in honor of all who served, then and now." James looked at his fellow bikers, then back at Harold. "We've been doing it wrong," he admitted. "Using our brotherhood to intimidate instead of support. But maybe—" He hesitated, then continued, "maybe we could learn a better way." Harold smiled, seeing in these young veterans the same search for connection he felt after coming home. "Brotherhood isn't about being tough," he said. "It's about being there for each other, and for others who need help." The morning that had started with tension was transforming into something beautiful, a bridge being built between generations of veterans, right there in Pete's diner, over cups of coffee and shared stories of sacrifice and honor. 1 month after that transformative morning at Pete's diner, the rumble of motorcycles once again filled the parking lot. But this time, when the bikers walked in, they came with respect and purpose. James led his group to Harold's corner booth, where the old veteran sat with his usual coffee and newspaper. "Right on time," Harold said with a warm smile, folding his newspaper neatly. The booth now had a small brass plaque on its side, reading "Veterans Corner. All who served are welcome." The bikers had changed in the past month. Their leather jackets were the same, but they'd added new patches, one showing a handshake between an old soldier and a young one, with the words "Generations of Honor" stitched below it. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, sir," James replied, settling into what had become his regular seat. The other bikers arranged themselves around nearby tables that had been pushed together to form one large gathering space. Sarah moved between them, pouring coffee with a bright smile. Every Sunday morning had become veterans' breakfast at Pete's diner. What started with Harold and the bikers had grown into something bigger. Today, the tables were filled with veterans from different eras: a Vietnam helicopter pilot, 2 Gulf War Marines, and even a young woman recently returned from Afghanistan. "Tell them about the foxhole prayer," Harold, Tommy, the youngest biker, asked eagerly. He traded his bandana for a neat haircut, and his eyes shone with admiration whenever Harold spoke. In just a month, he found the mentor he'd been looking for all along. But before Harold could begin, the diner's bell chimed. Everyone looked up to see 3 older men in pressed shirts entering, led by Mrs. Jenkins from the flower shop. "Found these gentlemen at the VFW hall," she announced proudly. "Told them they had to come see what was happening here." James immediately stood, recognizing the Vietnam War pins on their caps. He pulled up extra chairs, making room at the expanded table. The other bikers shifted to welcome the newcomers, offering coffee and introductions. "Quite a change from last month," Pete Jr. said quietly to Harold, posing by the booth. The cook had started opening the diner an hour earlier on Sundays to accommodate the growing veteran gatherings. Harold nodded, watching as James shared his grandfather's Bastogne photograph with the newcomers. The picture had become a sort of touchstone, passed carefully from hand to hand as veterans shared their own stories of service and sacrifice. The diner had transformed too. The walls now held a growing collection of military photographs, old and new, black and white and color, all donated by the veterans who'd made this place their Sunday home. Harold's D-Day photo held a place of honor, alongside James's grandfather with his tank. "You know what the best part is," Sarah said, refilling Harold's cup. "They're helping others now." She nodded toward a bulletin board by the door, covered with flyers for veteran support services, job opportunities, and the bikers' new community outreach program. It was true. James and his group had found a new mission. They still rode their motorcycles, still wore their leather jackets, but now they escorted military funerals, helped veteran families move, and mentored young service members returning to civilian life. Last week, Tommy shared excitedly, "We helped Mrs. Rodriguez fix her roof. Her husband was a Marine, served in Vietnam. Never thought I'd learn roofing skills from a World War II vet." He grinned at Harold, who had supervised the project from his lawn chair, sharing wisdom and stories. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, catching the silver in Harold's hair and the polished surface of his veteran's cap. At 93, he found a new purpose, bridging the gap between generations of warriors, helping young veterans find their way home just as that young German soldier had needed help so many years ago. "You've started something special here," one of the new Vietnam veterans said, looking around the packed diner. "Wish we'd had something like this when we came home." "It's never too late to find your brothers," Harold replied, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Sometimes you just need a place to belong and someone to remind you what service really means." The conversations flowed around the joined tables, war stories and peaceful moments, hard memories and healing laughter. The tough bikers who had tried to intimidate an old veteran now sat as equals with men and women from every generation of service, learning and sharing in the warmth of Pete's diner. And in his corner booth, Harold Thompson smiled, knowing that his most important mission might just be the one he was completing right here, one Sunday morning at a time, helping lost warriors find their way back to the brotherhood they'd never really left.